In 1787, state delegates gathered to debate how the national government should be altered. James Madison suggested that they should simply abandon the Confederation and replace it with a much stronger central government. This became known as the Virginia Plan. This proposal called for a bicameral legislature with the lower house elected by the people and the upper house elected by the lower house. Unlike the Confederation government, it would have a national executive, also chosen by the Congress, and a national judiciary. The smaller states were alarmed by these proposals. They recognized that under the Virginia Plan, they would have little representation. Instead, they put forth the New Jersey Plan. This proposal retained the basic structure of the Confederation, a unicameral legislature with each state having equal representation, regardless of population. However, it expanded the power of the central government to tax and regulate foreign and internal commerce. It also included a national executive and judiciary. After considerable debate, the Virginia Plan was accepted as the basis for further discussion. While this had been decided, there were still many points of contention. The smaller states continued to resist the idea of pure proportional representation, fearing that this would give too much power to the larger states. This point was resolved in what became known as the Connecticut or Great Compromise. It was agreed that while representation in the lower house would be proportional, by population, each state would have equal representation in the upper house, the Senate, with its members being chosen by state legislatures. There was also significant debate over slavery. A large proportion of the population of the southern states were slaves, and they feared that they would be politically dominated by northern states, which had much larger populations of free white men. States such as South Carolina feared as well that the northern states, which were moving towards emancipation, would interfere with the institution of slavery itself. Slavery was addressed in a number of ways. It was stipulated that 3/5 of the non-free population would be counted in determining representation, and the institution of slavery was tacitly protected by Section 2, Article 4, which obligated non-slave states to return fugitive slaves to their masters. The finished proposal created a much more powerful central government. Unlike the Confederation, it had the power to levy taxes and regulate commerce, and it provided for a strong national executive and a national judiciary. It also represented a shift away from pure democracy, which had been the trend at the state level. With the exception of the lower house, the House of Representatives, federal office holders were appointed. Senators were appointed by state legislatures. The president was appointed by an electoral college, whose members were also chosen by state legislatures, and the judiciary was appointed for life terms by the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate. At the same time, certain safeguards were built into the system. The delegates of the Constitutional Convention were well aware of the potential problems that could be created by giving one person or one group of people too much concentrated power. So they ensured that there would be separation of powers, checks and balances. Only the legislature may make laws, for instance, but their power was checked by the president's ability to veto legislation. Likewise, the president exercised sweeping executive powers, but he had to consult with Congress to appoint judges or make treaties with foreign nations. By the fall of 1787, the proposal for a new government had been completed, but it still had to be ratified by the people. Significant opposition emerged almost immediately. Opponents of the new Constitution, who called themselves anti-federalists, thought that the national government had become far too strong. They argued that true representative government had to be close to the people at the state and local level. A national government was too distant and too likely to become corrupt, even with the types of checks and balances embedded in the Constitution. They were particularly alarmed by the lack of specific protections for individual rights. The centers of opposition to the Constitution lay particularly in the back country. Traditionally, they had long been suspicious of governments controlled by the established coastal elites, and generally speaking, they had less need of a strong central government. Many of the provisions of the new government were designed to facilitate commerce, but the majority of the folks on the frontier were subsistence farmers who had little interest in commercial affairs. They raised food to feed their families, not to trade in foreign markets. The supporters of the Constitution responded with a well-organized campaign to convince the country to adopt this new form of government. Several supporters, most notably Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, authored powerfully persuasive newspaper articles, which were collectively called the Federalist Papers. They also sought to ease fears of government oppression by promising to add guarantees of individual rights to the Constitution once it had been ratified. This assurance, and some crafty political maneuvering, enabled the supporters to narrowly win enough votes to ratify the document.